When you change countries in your 50s, you don't just change your work, you risk losing who you are. When I moved to Shanghai at age 53, well, that became a very real problem because I just wasn't sure whether I had to become someone else. And that's a difficult place to be because you can see out there what success looks like, but then you're not sure that you want to become that thing. And at that point, at least for me, you're faced with a choice. Do you adapt, but then risk losing something essential? Or do you hold on to who you are, but risk becoming irrelevant? And that's the situation I found myself in when I arrived in Shanghai. And then what happened next? Well, it really changed the way I think about identity completely. Before I left London, I knew exactly who I was. I was an actor, I was a creative, I was a writer, and I did sales training along the way to make money. Now that identity made complete sense to me. It had a certain internal coherence. But here's the interesting thing about all of that. That identity that I'd put together, in a sense, that I'd evolved into, worked very well in London, but I wasn't yet sure whether it would survive somewhere else, and certainly whether it would survive in Shanghai. And so that single question followed me all the way to the great metropolis in China. And I remember the exact moment when I realized that it might not. Because when I arrived in Shanghai, well, the difference was immediate. It was obvious. It wasn't subtle. First of all, there was the sheer scale of the city, the sights, the smells, and the pace of everything, the sense that things were moving much faster than I had ever been accustomed to. And then there were the meetings. I remember walking into my first few meetings very clearly, the quiet rooms, ordered and supremely controlled. Now, I was wearing what I thought was a very good suit, pastel tones, and a slightly expressive, some might say flamboyant, crinkled flannel tie. And then I looked around the table. Dark suits, navy, black, grey, striped ties, perfectly knotted and aligned. And in that moment, I became really very aware of myself. I knew that my artistic floweriness had to go. But the colour of a suit and the style of a tie wasn't the problem. No, the real tension was internal. Because I could clearly see what success looked like in that environment, and it seemed to come with a very particular personality, controlled, measured, and restrained. And I remember thinking to myself, is this really what I have to become? Do I have to leave behind that creative essence of me, the expressive part, the rather theatrical way that I saw the world? Because that didn't feel like progress to me. That felt much more like reduction. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't a professional problem, it was an identity problem. And then something happened that changed my approach completely. So I was attending a networking event, one of those fairly typical evenings. There was polite conversation, business cards, people circulating rather like quiet vultures seeking prey. And then someone said something to me that I've never forgotten. So when he found out that I was a financial advisor, he told me, Howard, look, instead of you guys chasing after us, you should create something that attracts us. And that was a very interesting idea because up until that point, I'd been doing really what most people do. I'd been attending events, meeting a whole range of interesting people, being as charming, as witty, as urbane as possible, and then following up. And suddenly, the entire direction of my business apparently needed to reverse. So I went away and I thought about it. And at the time, by coincidence, there was an exhibition of Salvador Dalí paintings going on in Shanghai. Now, Dalí is not what you might call a subtle artist. Melting clocks, distorted reality, objects and people and landscapes and animals, all distinctly out of place. So I went along to the gallery ticket office and I asked them really a very simple question. If I buy 20 tickets, will you give me a discount? And they smiled and they nodded and they said yes. After that, I went to the nearby Langham Hotel in Shanghai, a 5-star establishment where I happen to know the Italian food and beverage manager. And I sat him down and I said to him, look, I want to give your chef a challenge. Now, I didn't actually know if this would work. It was, to say the least, an unusual request for the Langham Hotel. And this certainly wasn't how financial events were done. Normally, those were held inside the Langham's plush, air-conditioned meeting rooms. But that was the entire point. I said to the F&B manager, look, can your chef create a Salvador Dalí inspired afternoon tea? And he looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. and so I said, look, imagine cakes shaped like melting clocks. And so together we created this really special event. And it was unlike anything else happening in Shanghai at the time. There was no typical wine tasting, no predictable formulas and no expected formats. This was indeed rather surreal. In fact, I'm sure that Signor Salvador Dalí would have been proud because there were people there from Ferrari, people from major banks, all together inside a 5-star hotel looking at and eating cakes that appeared to be melting clocks, time itself bending. And what was really interesting was not just that they came for the cakes. No, it was why they really came. You see, these people, these expats in China, these were people, they were living inside a city of 26 million people and yet starved of something more than afternoon tea, no matter how surreal. No, they were operating in a very fast-moving business environment. It was certainly exciting, it was challenging, it was evocative. But for all of that, for us as Westerners, it was missing something rather more human. This need for connection. And that is what gave them a reason to gather together without being sold to. And in that moment, well, I realized something really important. I didn't have to abandon who I was. In fact, I could integrate it. That was probably the first moment that I really understood that creativity could be commercially structured. And what I realized more broadly was this. In fact, I hadn't lost anything essential. I'd simply reorganized and reframed it. The same instincts, the same way I always had of thinking, the exact same skills, but expressed in a form that my new environment could recognize and that my new environment could value. Now, this is something that many people really misunderstand. This whole principle of reinvention does not have to mean erasure. In the best cases, it means translation, because translation allows our depth to survive inside a brand new structure. So if you're at a point where something in your identity really needs to shift, but part of you feels as though it's resisting that shift, well, that may not be based on fear. It may rather be your intelligence speaking to you, because some things are just not meant to be abandoned. Some things they're meant to be carried forward. And the real work that we have to do as experts is learning how to carry them into a world that doesn't immediately recognize them. We don't need to abandon ourselves, but we do need to understand what must remain and then how to find a way to commercially carry it forward.